There was an article that was purported to have been written by her in one of the magazine, one of the Star or whatever those terrible things are, in which she made certain assertions and accusations that none of us ever believed a word of it.
Picture this. Millions of Americans tune in on a Tuesday night in May of 1984, wipe away tears as Howard Cunningham looks into their living rooms and thanks them for 11 years of friendship, and believe with total certainty that they have just watched the last episode of Happy Days. They hadn't. 4 more months of network television were still coming, and one final broadcast would quietly end the series in a way so different from that goodbye that historians still argue over which ending counts. Happy Days premiered on ABC in January of 1974, created by Garry Marshall, and by the time it left the air it had run for 11 seasons and more than 250 episodes, shaping an entire generation's idea of what nostalgia on television could look like. The show followed the Cunningham family of Milwaukee through the late 1950s and early 1960s, and along the way it turned a supporting biker character named Arthur Fonzarelli into one of the most recognizable figures in American pop culture. Henry Winkler, cast in that role after years of stage work and lean paychecks in New York, became so identified with a leather jacket and the raised thumb that the character's footprint eventually rivaled the show itself. By 1984, the series was winding down. Ron Howard, who had played Richie Cunningham since the pilot, had already left the show in 1980 to pursue directing full-time, a decision that in hindsight looks less like an ending and more like the first note of a career that would bring him an Academy Award for A Beautiful Mind. His departure forced Marshall and the writers to restructure the show around Fonzie, the Cunningham parents, and Joni and Chachi, whose romance had become the emotional engine of the later seasons. The finale everyone remembers is called Passages, and it aired on May 8, 1984. In it, Joni and Chachi finally marry, Fonzie formally adopts a son, and in a moment television historians still cite as a landmark of the era, Tom Bosley, playing Howard Cunningham, turns and speaks directly into the camera. Breaking the fourth wall in a network sitcom was not a common device in 1984. Audiences were used to a strict separation between the world on screen and the world watching it, and having a beloved father figure step outside that boundary to thank the audience by name, as a member of the family, struck many viewers as one of the most sincere farewells network television had ever produced. Marion Ross, who played Marion Cunningham, later spoke in interviews about how emotional that final taping was for a cast that had spent over a decade together. By any reasonable definition, that should have been the end. But American network television in the 1980s did not run on emotional logic. It ran on contracts, production orders, and advertising commitments, and Happy Days had episodes already filmed that had not yet been broadcast. Earlier that same year, ABC had committed enormous programming real estate to coverage of the 1984 Winter Olympics in Sarajevo, which ran from February 8 through February 19. Olympic broadcasts dominate primetime by design, since networks pay enormous rights fees and need wall-to-wall coverage to justify them, and regular series programming, Happy Days included, was pushed out of its usual slot for that stretch. Episodes produced for that window were simply held back, to be slotted in whenever the network could find room. That decision, mundane as it sounds, is the real hinge of this story. Because Happy Days was already scheduled to end its run in May with Passages, ABC now had a small stockpile of already produced, already paid for episodes with nowhere obvious to go. Rather than shelve them permanently and absorb the production cost as a total loss, the network chose to burn them off over the summer, a common but rarely beloved industry practice sometimes called burn-off scheduling, where finished episodes air out of story order, often opposite the emotional climax audiences believe they've already received. So between June and September of 1984, Happy Days quietly returned to ABC's schedule. Episodes like So How Was Your Weekend and Good News, Bad News aired that summer, months after Joni and Chachi's wedding, months after Howard Cunningham's speech to the camera, months after millions of families believed they had already said their goodbyes. For casual viewers, this created genuine confusion. The story had been closed. The Cunninghams were already gone. And yet there they were again, going about ordinary sitcom business as though nothing had happened. The episode that actually closed the series, the true final broadcast, aired on September 24, 1984. It was called Fonzie's Spots, and its plot centered on Fonzie trying to join Howard Cunningham's fraternal lodge, the Leopard Lodge, and being subjected to a hazing ritual by the other members. There was no wedding, no adoption, no direct address to the audience, no callback to 11 seasons of history. It was an ordinary half-hour of sitcom plotting, the kind a long-running show produces dozens of without anyone thinking twice, and it happened to be the one history assigned as the actual finish line. This is the part of the story television historians keep returning to when discussing how badly a network can misjudge the emotional stakes of ending a beloved series. A finale is not simply the last episode filmed. It functions as a kind of contract with the audience, a signal that the story has reached its natural conclusion and that viewers are permitted to let go. When Passages aired in May, ABC had, whether intentionally or not, honored that contract about as well as any network sitcom had up to that point. Then, through nothing more dramatic than a scheduling backlog created by Olympic coverage, the network quietly broke it, airing leftover episodes that undid the sense of closure the finale had worked so hard to build. It is worth being precise about what actually happened here, because the story has been exaggerated in the retelling over the years. This was not a secret conspiracy inside ABC, and there is no evidence of a deliberate effort to sabotage the show's legacy. What happened was far more mundane and, in its way, more revealing about how television actually worked behind the curtain in the 1980s. Contracts obligated the studio to deliver a certain number of episodes. Advertisers had bought time against those episodes. The Olympics disrupted the calendar. And a network with a business to run treated the remaining inventory the way it treated any other asset, by putting it on air and collecting the revenue, regardless of the story beats audiences had already processed. For the people who made the show, this had a lasting effect on how they talked about the ending for decades afterward. Interviews with cast members over the years reflect a kind of quiet frustration, less about the fact that unaired episodes existed, which is a routine reality of production, and more about the fact that audiences never got any real explanation for why the Cunninghams kept reappearing after their goodbye had already aired. There was no on-air acknowledgement, no framing device, nothing to signal that what they were watching had technically been produced earlier in the season. It simply appeared on the schedule as though the finale had never happened. Henry Winkler, whose career became almost inseparable from Fonzie for more than a decade, later spoke candidly about how difficult the years immediately following the show's end were for him professionally. Typecasting is one of the most well-documented hazards of long-running television success, and Winkler has said plainly that finding work outside the leather jacket proved far harder than landing the role. In the first place had been. It would take roles in the 1990s, including his work in Scream, and later his Emmy-winning performance in HBO's Barry, for Winkler to fully step outside the shadow of the character that made him famous. What makes this story stick with people, even 4 decades later, is not really the mechanics of network scheduling. It is the emotional whiplash of watching a story end twice, once with real closure and once without any at all. Audiences in 1984 experienced something television has since tried hard to avoid repeating, a finale that meant everything, followed by an anticlimax that meant almost nothing, months apart, on the same channel, with no acknowledgement that anything unusual was happening. It is a small case study in how the business side of an industry can quietly overwrite the emotional intentions of the people making the art, not through malice, but through the ordinary, unglamorous machinery of contracts, rights fees, and burn-off schedules. In the years since, the surviving cast has found its own ways to make peace with how it all ended. Ron Howard's career as a director has more than eclipsed his years playing Richie Cunningham. Marion Ross remained a familiar presence in television well into her later years. Tom Bosley, who passed away in 2010, was remembered by many fans specifically for that speech to the camera, a moment still circulated and re-watched far more often than Fonzie's induction into a fraternal lodge ever will. And in 2024, at an Emmy broadcast marking the show's 50th anniversary, Ron Howard and Henry Winkler stood together and recreated one of the character's most famous beats, a small, unscripted kind of closure that felt, to many longtime fans, like the ending the show never quite got to have the first time. There is also a broader lesson here about how the television industry of that era treated its own history. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, it was not unusual for a series to have a handful of completed episodes sitting on a shelf when a season wrapped, victims of preemptions or scheduling miscalculations. Most of the time, nobody outside the industry noticed or cared, because those shows were still ongoing and the leftover episodes simply slid into the following season without controversy. Happy Days is remembered differently precisely because it happened at the worst possible moment, immediately after a finale that had done everything right. Had those 5 episodes aired in April instead of after Passages, this would be a footnote in television trivia rather than a story fans still bring up decades later. Timing, more than any single decision, is what turned an unremarkable bit of scheduling housekeeping into a lasting piece of television lore. It also says something about how differently networks and audiences measured the value of a story's ending. To ABC's programming department, an episode was an episode, a 30-minute block that had already been paid for and needed to be monetized regardless of where it fell in the emotional arc of the series. To the millions of people who had spent 11 years with the Cunninghams, the ending was not a matter of accounting. It was the closing of a relationship built one Tuesday night at a time, across more than a decade of adolescence, parenthood, heartbreak, and laughter. That mismatch between how an industry defines value and how an audience experiences meaning is not unique to Happy Days, but few shows illustrate it as clearly, because few had already delivered as emotionally satisfying a goodbye before the mismatch became public. Happy Days never really lost its place in American television history. Its influence on later sitcoms, its role in launching Ron Howard's directing career, and its creation of one of the most enduring characters in the medium all remain intact regardless of how the broadcast calendar shook out that summer. But the story of its actual ending is a useful reminder that the version of a story audiences remember and the version that technically happened are not always the same, and that even the most heartfelt goodbye can be quietly undone by nothing more dramatic than a network clearing its inventory before the fall season began.